Darlings, what a wonderful surprise it is to see so many of you here. I must confess, my dear, dear hearts, there are at least 100 things I wish to say to you. It has been an absolute age since you and I last set eyes upon one another. All of you, please gather round. As long as you are warm and dry, I am a happy and contented soul. Now, of course, the question is, my darlings, as to what you see before you now is entirely up to you. Now, I think that most of you, of course, are here to see you know whom. But as for the others, well, some of you perhaps are desirous of seeing Maxim de Winter. Now, it is true, I have spent much of my professional career in the 19th century. Occasionally, I have dipped a toe, tentatively at that, to the 1920s or beyond, but I have one of those faces, you understand. Some of you perhaps may be desirous of seeing before you, dear Dorian Gray. Then again, some of you will perhaps be hoping before your darling eyes, young Freddie. Or wasn't he an absolute angel? Such a darling voice as well. And then again, some of you may perhaps be wishing that here I sit before you, the Count Dracula himself. A wonderful role, all of them magnificent in their own way. But I believe most of you will be seeing me dressed rather funereally, as an undertaker perhaps. Why, I mean, of course, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. None of this is real, you understand. Imagine this to be the dressing room of my imagination, the green room of your mind. Please, my darlings, you will gather round if convenient. If inconvenient, please, you will gather round all the same. Make a long arm for a carafe of brandy and water. The evening gloom gathers apace. The weather can perhaps be intemperate. I feel that within our own social circle, within the bonds of friendship, there is so much to keep us warm. You know, in many ways, ladies and gentlemen, this is nothing more, nothing less than a case of identity. Well, I mean to say, who am I? Is it a case of Jeremy Brett playing Sherlock Holmes or Mr. Holmes playing Jeremy Brett? You know, I am even a figment of my own creation. There is no Jeremy Brett. Now, I was born at a very young age. Jeremy Huggins, near Coventry in Warwickshire. You may recollect the first of my darling Watsons, dear David Burke. Once he described me as being quite mad. Mad, I was livid. Well, I mean to say, my mother died when I was so young. I seem to have an agony of anger compressed within me. I seem to regard the universe itself as being at fault. Why she had been taken away from me when I was so needful of her companionship. And yet, you understand, I always had rather a wet, uninteresting face until I believe the age of 36 or so. I had so much anger, so much resentment within me to convey to the world at large, and yet all I could manage was a little pout of irritation. At least now I find I'm an aging, pretty face. I'm able to illustrate some of the feelings, the emotions that I feel within. As for my father was a military man, a soldier, a brave man. In many ways, not dissimilar to Sherlock Holmes himself. He kept his emotions very much contained within. Well, naturally, it was hoped on my father's part that I would follow in his militaristic footsteps. Now, it was to be first of many disappointments that my father received at my hands. Well, you understand, what is good enough for our fathers is never good enough for us, is it? Well, sometimes I wish, if only for my father's sake, I had joined the army, but I wonder what would the army have made of me, and what on earth would I have made of the army? I was bitten by the bug at a very tender age, deciding to be an actor. Even when I was at school, I was known to burst into song at the drop of a hat. My father despaired. Why could I not be like everyone else? Of course, he was absolutely determined the name of Huggins were not to be dragged through the mud by being plucked through the footlights. Only said if I was to darken the family name, then I must eschew the name first and foremost. Jeremy Huggins was no more. Jeremy Brett was born. Et voila! Now, my darling friends, you may wonder how it is that I chanced upon the name of Brett. Well, Brett happened to be the name of the tailor who had made my first suit. Well, as I said to my father at the time, he ought to have counted his blessings it was not made by Moss Frost. Do you know, even to this day, I remain at something of a loss as to why I was considered for the role of Mr. Holmes at all. I am so dissimilar to him. I'm far more like Watson. I mentioned Count Dracula earlier on. Fascinating role. So sensual. Good wonder that both men and women find him so irresistible. Well, it was while still in the United States. I had my first brush with Conan Doyle when I played Dr. John Watson himself. Charlton Heston, that wonderful Hollywood icon, played Holmes on that occasion. Now, I always regarded Watson as being such a sweet, kind, generous individual. Now, you'll have to take me a trust now, my darlings. I thought I'd be so much better as Watson. I'm gregarious by nature, kind, I trust, generous. What on earth did they see in me? Well, in spite of myself, I decided to audition, although I have to say, a dear friend of mine, Robert Stevens, who played Sherlock Holmes under the auspices of that terrific director, Billy Wilder. Robert advised me against accepting the part. You see, Robert Stevens had been driven to the very brink, to the edge of that abyss, gazing down into that seething, broiling the cauldron. He had only played the detective in one film. There I was, poised to portray him in a dozen, a Baker Street dozen. Well, I mean to say I'm nothing like him, am I? I always feel that the detective is far better suited to those dark, saturnine actors. Peter Cushing, for example, magnificent. I always believe it was Cushing who was able to draw forth the friendship between the detective and his Boswell, John. Basil Rathbone, of course, he hardly needed to spend any time in makeup whatsoever. He could almost walk straight onto the set. He was Sherlock Holmes. And then here was Jeremy Huggins, Barkswell in Coventry. We understand I was so tired of failure, but I believe you reach a point in life. You're done with failing. You don't wish to be drawn through that mill ever again. I shudder now when I think of my audition. Reliable witnesses claim that I must have resembled a gargoyle afflicted with a severe bout of St. Vitus's dance. I had taken it into myself to smear my face with various streaks of white grease paint, rather a violent shade of violet under the chin. And as for that walk, oh, dear hearts, as though I were possessed by the spirit of some long deceased crab scuttling across, and the voice. And yet, in spite of that, I won the role. Still, at the very least, I do not have to sport a prosthetic nose. No, I am led to believe that is the ignominious fate shared by Christopher Lee when he played the detective in 1962, I believe. It was such a burden. I mean to say, it's such a weight of responsibility I realized pressing down upon my shoulders. The ideal Holmes does not exist. He is purely a fictional creature, a marvel of the imagination. How could I possibly hope to convey the Sherlock Holmes of that gentleman, and yet at the same time to satisfy that lady and those children? But as I say, I'd already tired of failing. One gets to the stage when one has failed enough. I regarded the role of Holmes as being a mountain to climb. I'd arrived at the juncture where there was no other option but to climb that mountain, and I did. Well, I mean to say, I wished at least to be able to say to myself, I did not screw it up entirely. It is so wonderful to see you all again. It's been so long. Well, as I say, I went through absolute agonies bringing Holmes to life. He and I are so dissimilar. We are chalk and cheese. Well, you might perhaps have heard that I am prone to occasional bouts of eccentricity. I can be something of an extrovert. When the mood is upon me, I'm rather taken with conversing with complete strangers. As for Holmes, he is absolute marvel. A face of marble. Trying to ascertain Sherlock Holmes is akin to snatching an arrow in mid-flight. Impossible, you understand. But then I was blessed by having such a wonderful cast, a wonderful team at Granada Studios. I mean, of course, Michael Cox, June Wyndham Davis, both of my Watsons, David and dear Ted. Not only were they the best of Boswells, I was blessed indeed to have called both of them my friend. But the agonies that I had to endure, oh, I love not. But every time Baker Street loomed, every time the shadow of Mr. Holmes was cast athwart my sunny disposition, I had to subsist entirely, my darlings, upon half a carrot, and perhaps the merest whiff of a stick of celery. Agonies, of course. The costuming was very flattering. Well, I'm not at all like Mr. Holmes's physique. I'm rather broad-shouldered, broad-chested, and Holmes is so narrow. I think it was when I found a walk, first of all. The rest of the character followed, these very long, elongated, pointed boots that I'm forced to wear. Oh, I don't mean that crab-like scuttle of a long-dead crustacean that I inflicted upon the casting director in the audition room. No, I mean the war. And of course, no doubt you have read about my problems. The press and their salacious rumors. I always maintain the press is a wonderful institution, provided, of course, one is aware of how to use it to one's own advantage. I've discussed my travails for more than enough. I want to dwell on them here. It is happiness that has brought us all together this night. So many of you darling, darling people thinking of me, even so many years after the event. Is it not a wonderful thing how Mr. Holmes has brought So many complete strangers from all over the globe together. Bless his dear heart. Well, of course, I soon fell into a routine of my own, an absolute perfectionist, and then I was aware, perhaps, this is what Robert was warning me against. Well, to begin with, we never had enough time in which to rehearse. I was determined if I was to be assigned the task of bringing Mr. Holmes to life, then I would do everything, my damnedest, within my power to see that Sir Arthur's creation was done justice. It took to moping about within my hotel room, having a meal sent up to me. And of course, Mr. Holmes is such a difficult character to cast aside at the end of a day's filming. I felt I had to cleanse myself. I had to be clean, really clean, you understand, to wash that awful gunk out of my hair. And then, of course, certain habits emerge. But to begin with, half a bottle of wine at dinner, and then a year later, a bottle, and then perhaps a glass of champagne, and so on and so forth. Or at least it wasn't a 7%. But when all is said and done, my darling friends, what is a magnum of morphine or a carafe of cocaine between acquaintances? I remember still when I made dear David, then bright red, crimson with embarrassment, I serenaded him across the crowded restaurant. It was his birthday, I seem to recall. There was David with his charming wife, his dear young son. He was mortified. Oh, you understand, all of those rumors he had heard regarding my eccentricity were not entirely wide of the mark. No, I have been blessed with my Watsons. David and dear Ted, it is a curious thing, they were there for me when I was at my lowest ebb, particularly Ted. I remember one time when I was incarcerated, I thought perhaps the world had forgotten all about me, and yet whom was there to meet me? None other but Ted. He picked me up. Or had long since cast aside the habit of driving. He took care of me. He made me a cup of tea. He was kind. There is such wonderful kindness, ladies and gentlemen. In spite of what the politicians would have us believe, people are so kind. I believe there is not enough kindness in the world, nor charity, and yet to see all of you here this evening. It's a curious thing how one takes certain things for granted. And I'm aware that when the mood was upon me, I said such awful things, and yet my friends forgave me. I could not blame them if they washed their hands of me altogether, and yet they did not. What on earth could I possibly ever have done to have deserved such friends? In the acting profession, you understand, addiction is par for the course. I remember when I worked in the theater in the States, quite often I had to pass by the homeless, the addicts on the way to the theater stage door. We were on first name terms. Before too long, they would wave to me. And I would always stop to talk to them. There were individuals there, but for the grace of God to go, I, and you, and you. It is why you understand. When Granada and their wonderful team came to bring the Devil's Foot to the screen, I wished, temporarily at least, for Mr. Holmes to kick his habit. I was made aware how much of a role model Mr. Holmes was to children. I just received so many fan letters, sometimes 2,000 or so a week. I found it so wonderfully encouraging for all of these young minds, absorbent like a sponge. Now, of course, I asked Sir Arthur's charming daughter, Dame Jean, first. Did she agree with my idea that we ought to see Sherlock Holmes dispense with his drugs, with his syringe? God bless her, she agreed it was a capital suggestion. It is not to say that one day Holmes may not relapse, but I thought it was important that we show these young, impressionable minds that demons can, indeed are slayed, are laid low. It's a wonderful thing, is it not, about a broken heart? To allow so much love, compassion to come flooding in. Perhaps that is what hearts are there for, to be broken. It's always wonderful seeing the children, I mean, at the matinee performances. Oh, Ted and I, at Wyndham's Theatre initially, and then we toured The Secret of Sherlock Holmes. And so many of those children would wait for me at the stage door, and Ted. And once I remember one charming little boy, young Samuel, he showed to me a drawing he had done. He said, "Mr. Brad, I have brought this picture for you." And it showed Sherlock Holmes slaying a dragon. And he said, "Mr. Brad, Sherlock Holmes slays my dragon." Such a wonderful responsibility, don't you see? And of course, it was very flattering suddenly to find myself the object of female attention. All of those letters, they find Holmes to be irresistible. He is aloof, impregnable indeed to the finer, softer emotions. Oh, I know there is Irene Adler, but he has deliberately jettisoned himself away from all that is extraneous to his science of analysis and deduction. He always regarded Mr. Holmes to be a challenge. Holmes, of course, is a fantasy, a creature of the imagination. And yet Ted and I, David would always agree that we are weaving dreams, are we not? If only for the briefest of times are we making flesh and blood people's highest aspirations, bringing into reality all that so many people, both in this day and age and for a century past, hold so dear to their own hearts. What a responsibility. They have given us their dreams. Do you not feel that I owe it to them, at the very least, to tread softly? I remember at Wyndham's, dear Ted was quite often driven to distraction when I would perhaps extemporize with the script. If music be the fruit of love, play on. Give me excessive, that surfeiting the appetite may sicken, and so die. Oh, Holmes never lived. Nor did he love, but I did. I never considered myself to be a star. No, that ship sailed. You see, I have one of those faces forever entombed within the 19th century. And I never have been the kind of person to go looking. Rather, I am the person who's found. A twinkler. And dear Joni, she made me sparkle that little bit more. We are kindred spirits. She and I would finish each other's sentences. Joni would make me feel so alive, so vibrant. Joni, I know, would find all of you so extremely delightful. I feel certain that Joni and Mr. Binks are getting along famously now. Well, Joni, you understand, is the kind of person, if one is fortunate, one is only ever likely to meet once in a handful of lifetimes. And who would have thought that I did? Do you know, my darlings, I am forced to wonder if, in some other world, dear Jeremy Huggins did go about his own business. The world had never heard of Jeremy Brett. Oh, they found some other actor to play Mr. Holmes. Actors are, after all, tenpenny. Well, you know what they say about actors, they're only one step removed from politicians. I wonder if Jeremy Huggins made his father proud. Jeremy Huggins, I feel certain, would have followed in his father's footsteps. No doubt he resides still in Warwickshire. I do think that I would have liked him. I feel half inclined to believe Jeremy Huggins would have liked me. And yet, my darling friends, imagine how much Jeremy Huggins did not experience. All those wonderful people he would not have met. Joan, Mr. Binks, David, Ted, Linda. All those wonderful children. And David Huggins. Never could a father have been as proud as I am of him. It is a curious thing, my loves. Apropos, Mr. Holmes, I've already indicated that we chosen few, are selected, if only for a little while, to impersonate certain icons. Basil, Peter, and there will be others. I was fortunate enough to carry that baton, if only for a little while. As I've already said, I sincerely trusted I did not screw things up entirely. And you know, I wonder if Mr. Holmes and I would have enjoyed one another's company. I hope down the years I was at least able to see some of the cracks in the marble, to have come close at least to snatching that arrow in mid-flight. I am reliably informed that Sherlock and I share certain similarities. Our moods, perhaps our irritability. As you know, there have been instances where Mr. Holmes and I had arranged dinner. Once, I understand, we were in the same building, however, we never did meet. If, my darling, darling friends, any of you should meet Mr. Holmes, and it will only be a glimpse, there he is in the distance. You'll be certain to send him my love, will you not? To wave. Well, I fear the time allotted to me this night to see my friends once again draws inevitably to a close. Time is such a waste of money. It has been a pleasure to see all of you here. To think of the kindness, the shared kindness that has brought us as one. Promise me, will you not, to keep dry and warm, always. Be kind. One final thing, many years ago now, the past was the present. Now, one or two people had used to remark that I reminded them of Mr. Holmes. How similar we had used to look. But I had to let them down gently. My darlings, you see, it was only a case of mistaken identity.